Imagine this. Midnight cloaks a forgotten medieval village. The fire is long dead, shadows curling in corners. 10 souls sleep shoulder to shoulder on matted straw children, elders, servants, and a goat tied beside the hearth. Somewhere, in that stifling dark, a hand reaches across the stillness. Gently, cautiously. A husband searching for his wife. No walls, no sheets, no privacy, only breath, shared with strangers, and silence heavy with ears. So how did love survive in a world where solitude did not exist? When desire flickered quietly under the weight of shame, where did intimacy go to hide? In the medieval home, even the concept of room was a luxury. What we call a studio apartment today would have been an extravagant estate. For most, the house was a single-space, wooden walls if you were lucky, sod and stone if you weren't. In northern lands, longhouses stretched low and dark, with turf roofs and central fires that choked the air. Everyone lived here, the newlyweds, the newborn, the goat, and the grandmother, and everyone slept here. On a shared mattress of straw laid over wood, or often, directly on the ground, wrapped in itchy wool, no pillows, no sheets, no partitions, certainly no doors. Privacy wasn't rare. It was myth. 13th century land records tell us this was the norm. The hall, or open hall, was the only heated space. Probate inventories didn't list separate beds for couples, they listed one. A communal bed for the entire household. Daylight and darkness weren't opposites, they were shifts. A table became a bed. A bench, a cradle, a blanket that swaddled a child by night became a shawl for the grandmother by morning. And within this confined world, marriages unfolded. Vows made, meals shared, but no privacy given. Even the wedding night, the one moment we imagine belongs only to two, was often a public affair. In some villages, witnesses escorted couples to their bedding, ensuring consummation was real. Intimacy wasn't romantic. It was a ritual of navigation. One record from 14th century Yorkshire speaks of a woman who lay with her husband behind the bread oven, the only corner they could claim for themselves. In Essex, a servant described hearing her master and mistress nightly, separated only by a curtain of cloth. Love didn't have a room, it had timing. Parents waited for their children to sleep. Some waited for market days, when the house emptied. Others didn't wait at all. The church taught that marriage came with a debt, an obligation to fulfill conjugal rights. So husbands and wives did what they must, voices low, blankets high, movements hushed beneath a shared understanding that everyone was listening. In one way, love was never alone. In another, it was never free. When walls couldn't be built, curtains rose instead, thick wool, fur-lined, patched, and nailed into rafters. They didn't block sound, but they created something just as powerful, the illusion of space. Even a thin veil meant something, a space to undress without shame. A breath of imagined privacy, a sanctuary made from fabric and hope. By the 15th century, curtains became household staples, listed alongside pots and pans in inventories. For townsfolk, the master's bed was often the only one with drapes. That bed, the four-poster, became more than furniture. It was a room within a room, a secret cove of warmth and touch, belonging to 2 instead of 10. Still, most made do with less. A curtain strung across a corner, a mat propped up against the wall, a blanket tacked to a beam. It wasn't about keeping others out. It was about keeping something sacred in. In this shared world, privacy was invention. Intimacy became an art of strategy. Couples read the rhythm of the room. When the baby's breath slowed, when the fire hissed low, when footsteps fell away, outside silence became a signal, a language, a promise. Words were dangerous, but a glance, a single look across the straw at dusk, that was enough. They left signs. A shoe turned sideways, a lantern placed deliberately, a handkerchief tied just so. These were codes. This was how love spoke when it couldn't raise its voice. Sometimes, escape was possible. If the house was too loud, too full, too close, couples fled behind the barn into the bakehouse. to the shaded wall near the coop. These were not romantic retreats. They were stolen sanctuaries. Love, in this world, had to travel through hay, through frost, through mud. In winter, the darkness arrived early. The cold silenced voices. People drifted into sleep longer, deeper. In those hours, as frost claimed the windows and mice rustled in the straw, lovers found their slender window of grace. Not a door, not a lock, but enough to reach out. Enough to remember that they were not just laborers or mothers or tenants. They were, still, two souls who chose each other. But everything changed with class. The poor slept by the hearth, the cradle, the cow. For them, intimacy was not spontaneous, it was choreographed. But for the minor lord, the merchant, the landowning yeoman, a new space emerged, the solar, an upper room, sometimes with a chimney, sometimes with a door, a lock, a key. 14th century inventories from Kent speak of personal chests, linen sheets, actual chambers, divided by stone and wood. In these spaces, love could unfold without witness, but even here, walls whispered, floors creaked. Servants, GOSSIPED. Privacy, in truth, was never guaranteed. It was scaled, it was purchased, it was performed. But what happens when even curtains fail? You leave the house. Lovers, especially young, unmarried, or desperate, found solitude where no one dared linger. Under hedges, in fields, behind the granary door. Church records call these acts sinful. But were they sin, or were they survival? Couple caught beneath the granary loft while the house was full of guests. A tryst behind the mill wall while the world looked elsewhere. These stories aren't tales of scandal. They're stories of resistance, and this is where the story will take its most haunting turn. Because the last part is not about hay, or hearths, or curtains. It's about how judgment followed even into silence. What you're about to hear next may forever change how you see privacy, love, and the walls we build today. But in the medieval world, even silence wasn't safe. Desire, even between spouses, came wrapped in suspicion. The church never stopped speaking of sex, but it almost never spoke of love. Intimacy was allowed, yes, but only when tied to procreation. Passion, however, fondness, pleasure, those were signs of sin. Even within marriage, priests were instructed to ask difficult questions in the confessional. Did you embrace with too much fondness? Did you speak wanton words while others slept? Did you love without the purpose of children? Guilt wasn't measured only by the act, but by where and when it happened, and by who else might have heard. Ecclesiastical courts flourished on whispers. One record from Norwich in 1442 recounts a neighbor testifying that a married couple lay together after dark while her mother snored in the same room. Another spoke of laughter and creaking floorboards behind a hanging cloth. Walls were thin. Homes were wood and thatch. Everything could be heard, and someone always listened, sometimes out of malice, sometimes out of jealousy, often out of nothing more than boredom. And so, love was never just between two people. It was a quiet defiance against judgment, against shame, against the ever-present ear pressed to timber. But at night, something happened, something sacred, not privacy, but mercy. When the candles gutted out, when the fire dimmed to coal, when even the mice fell silent, the world for once stopped watching. And there, in the hush, love endured. A hand slipped into another beneath a woolen sheet. A breath warmed a sleeping neck. Fingers brushed fingers under coarse blankets, and no one saw. Not the neighbors, not the servants, not the priest. Maybe not even God. These weren't grand passions, they were small mercies. A kiss on frostbitten fingers. A palm resting on a lover's chest, just to know he was still breathing. A whispered promise to soft even for the straw to remember. And that, perhaps, is where intimacy was most powerful. Not in the act, but in the choosing. Over and over. Despite everything, by the late 16th century, something began to change. Privacy once imagined became structure. It crept in like warmth through a long cold wall. Wealthy households were now designed with walls that spoke of silence. Rooms multiplied. Blueprints divided space by function. A hall for guests, a kitchen for labor, a bedroom for love, and even remarkably, withdrawing room, built solely to step away from company. Architecture itself began to whisper, "This space is yours." This moment, in towns, houses grew taller. Sleeping chambers climbed to second floors. Fireplaces warmed individual rooms. Shutters thickened. Doors began to lock. And with those locks, intimacy exhaled for the first time in centuries. For the rural poor, it was slower. Their homes remained crowded, noisy, shared. But still curtains appeared. Wooden screens, corner beds, chimneys that carried smoke away. Finally, brick replaced wattle and daub. Glass windows, once rare, closed out the cold. Even the poorest began to find ways to carve out moments for love, not stolen, but sacred. And then something even more profound happened. Intimacy stopped being something to hide. It became something to protect. Privacy wasn't just about closing out the world. It was about letting love grow in silence. So how did couples find intimacy in one-room homes? They didn't wait for space. They made it. With curtains, with timing, with rhythm, with glances held too long, with breaths shared in stillness. They loved when they were cold. They loved when they were watched. They loved when silence wasn't given, so they created it. They didn't need doors to close. They only needed each other, because love didn't survive in those homes because the world made it easy. It survived because two people chose again and again to see only each other. Even when the world watched. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it last. Not the music, not the privacy, not the perfect lighting, but the stubborn, quiet, steady choosing of one another, even when the world presses in. So the next time you close your door, dim the lights, turn the key in the lock, and feel alone with the one you love, remember those who had none of it. And still, they loved. Not loudly, not easily, but with fierce, unspoken tenderness. I've always believed that silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of things too sacred to speak aloud. When I look back at those dim, cold, overcrowded homes, I don't see poverty. I see two people making space for each other when there was no space to give a touch, a glance, a breath in the dark, a promise, spoken not with words but with presence. In today's world, we can shut out the noise, but too often, we shut each other out. They didn't. They loved, not despite the discomfort, but through it. And I wonder, isn't that the kind of love that survives longest? Not grand, not loud, just constant, to people holding on, even when the world gave them no reason to. And maybe that's why their story still whispers in the straw, in the dark, in the silence we carry with us now.